In this chapter, we're going to be discussing motivation. Ooh, this sounds like a fun topic. So we have finally made our transition out of industrial psychology and into organizational psychology. So I thought I'd take a moment to remind you that organizational psychology is the systematic study of dispositional variables and situational variables that influence the behaviors and the experiences of individuals and groups at work. Dispositional variables are things that the employee carries around inside them. So that would be personality variables, intelligence, motivation, things like that. And then situational variables, of course, would be the things that are outside of the individual. So the work situation, their home situation, their relationship situations, things like that. Really anything inside the person or outside the person that could influence their behaviors and their experiences while they're at work, and that can influence the way that the groups that they belong to function at work. Okay, so within organizational psychology, there are a lot of different topics. There is motivation, which conveniently we're doing in this lecture. There are job attitudes. There are stress and worker well-being topics to cover. There are group processes and work team issues. And then there's leadership and organizational theory and development. And just FYI, we're not going to get to those last two. We're going to focus our attention for the remainder of the quarter on these four main topics: motivation, job attitudes, stress and worker well-being, and then group processes and work teams. All right. Well, that is our overview of where we're going for the rest of the quarter. So let's start off talking about motivation and talk specifically about work motivation. Work motivation is the force that drives people to behave in a way that energizes them, that it results in the expenditure of effort. It directs them, it channels their effort toward a particular object or place, and it sustains them. It continues their effort over a period of time. So when we talk about work motivation, we're talking about this force that energizes people to work, that directs their work efforts in a particular way, and it sustains their efforts at work. It's really important to note that the way that we're defining motivation here cannot be construed as being the same thing as performance. We talked a lot about performance in the industrial side of this textbook. From here, we're going to be talking about motivation in this chapter, where we're actually talking about something that's inside the individual that might manifest itself in improved performance. It might manifest itself in reduced performance, but that's not really what we're trying to get at here. That's a side effect of the thing that we're trying to get at. Motivation can lead to improved performance. Lack of motivation can lead to decreased performance. So what we're trying to get at here is that first part, the motivation. And the reason why I'm really emphasizing this is that, for one thing, the word motivation is really a concept. It's not something that is objective and can be seen, and we can all agree exactly what it means and things like that. Performance is something that we can see. And so for psychologists, historically, we've emphasized studying things that we can directly observe. So performance has all of this different background that we've been talking about so far in class, whereas motivation has been a little trickier for psychologists to really figure out a way to study. All right, now there are three major categories of motivation theories, and we're going to talk about all three of these across a sequence of lectures. So we have the need, motive, value theories, the cognitive choice theories, and the self-regulation theories. Now, just in general, an overview, the need, motive, value theories all emphasize the role of personality traits and stable dispositions, needs that the person has inside of them, and values that they carry with them. The cognitive choice theory, on the other hand, emphasizes that people are active decision makers. So because of that, this model assumes that people try to be rational in choosing what to do, how much effort to exert, those kinds of things. So what might look like motivation, that some kind of internal state, is really about the person making conscious, rational decisions. Self-regulation theories say that the manner in which individuals monitor their own behaviors and make adjustments to those behaviors in pursuit of their goals is what we mean by motivation. So in this theory, we're going to be looking at, that self-regulation, a person looking at how they've acted, looked at how those behaviors have benefited them or not. And these, this self-reflection will help them to decide how to adjust their behaviors going forward so that they are more likely to achieve their goals. So you can really see that these three models, these three theories are taking very different positions on motivation, what drives a person to act the way that they act, things like that. So let's get started with the need, motive, value theories. And just to make it fun, there are three theories that fall under the needs, motives, Maslow's hierarchy, Alderfers EG Theory, and Herzberg's two-factor theory. And then there's one model that would be what we call a value theory, and that's job characteristics theory. So let's dive in. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm going to bet that most of you have seen this hierarchy of needs in some context somewhere before. I'm not the first person to show you Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So hopefully this is all a little bit of review for you. The idea is we've got this pyramid because the needs at the bottom are more pressing and need to be met, must be met, before you can really start working your way up the pyramid and start pursuing higher level needs. So based on this model, the idea is that people behave in order to satisfy their needs. So because we're motivated by the lower order needs first, the physiological needs for food, for air, for water, clothing, sleep, stuff like that, those needs have to be met before we can really turn our attention to the safety needs, for example. Once we have a lower order need at least partially met, we can start turning our attention to the higher order needs. Those become more motivating. Those become our bigger driver. There's not much empirical support to support Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As a good humanist, he was more theoretical and kind of philosophical in his design of this theory, and a little bit less data-driven. I thought I had another animation. Well, I'll just have to tell you what I thought was written on this slide. So according to Maslow, for the average person in the US, about 90% of our physiological needs are met at any given time. So most of us have been, fed recently enough. We've gotten a decent night's sleep. We have enough to wear, and there's oxygen in our air, stuff like that. We have the vast majority of those needs met. And so for the average American, they're the next level to motivate us would be safety and security, right? Well, for most Americans, he says about 70% of their safety and security needs are met. Their concerns about their health and their employment and property and their family and social stability, that security part is mostly met. And so as a result, what motivates most Americans the most strongly, he says, are the next two levels, that most of us are driven by the love and belongingness needs and then the self-esteem needs. And he says that, for a lot of Americans, about 60% of their love and belongingness needs are met. They have friends, they have, a decent relationship with their family, might have a intimate, romantic partner that they can rely on, stuff like that. So they have that need mostly met. It may not be perfect. There are times when you feel like, your partner doesn't care what you have to say or other things, but that mostly it's met. About 60% of the time it's met. And so that means probably self-esteem is the biggest motivator for the average American. And if you look at what's listed under self-esteem, you could see a lot of work-related things being sort of subsumed under self-esteem, right? Confidence, achievement, respect of others, the need to be a unique individual. It can be a hit to our self-esteem if we feel like our individuality isn't being expressed, things like that. He says that most of us are bogged down in the self-esteem needs, that we only have a little bit of energy left over to try and do the self-actualization needs, to behave in spontaneous ways, to be accepting, to experience purpose, have meaning in our lives and inner potential and all those things. We don't have as much time for that because we're kind of bogged down in the self-esteem needs. Like I said, there's very little empirical support for this model, but it's sort of one of those models that sticks around because it kind of makes sense to a lot of us. We're like, yeah, that would explain a lot of my behaviors. Yeah, that really does make sense. It explains the observed behaviors we might have of others. Maybe you see a person who's sleeping on the street and you think, aren't they worried that somebody's going to steal what little they have? And the fact is, if you are bogged down in your physiological needs, you need sleep. You're not sure where your next meal is coming from. You don't have enough energy left over and enough motivation left over to worry about your safety and security at the moment. Right? Like sleep is the most pressing thing. So observing other people, you might be able to say, oh, that model makes a lot of sense. I just want to really drive home that we're not sure that it explains anything, basically. But it does make intuitive sense. Now, Alderfers EG Theory, it has a very neat flow chart that goes with it. So it must be scientific, right? And it even has a legend to let you know what the different arrows mean. So if it's got a solid arrow, that means that, the person's experiencing satisfaction and they're progressing to the next level. If it's dashed, it means that they're experiencing frustration and they're actually going to regress a little bit. And then the curved thick arrow means that they may be spending a lot of time in that one need, satisfying it, strengthening it, and stuff like that. Now, the word satisfaction in this model means an internal state resulting from attainment of goals. Sounds very behavioristic the way that they've phrased this. So this is clearly a model that was developed mid 20th century. And they definitely were trying to use very behavioristic terms to make it seem a little bit more like they were studying something that was observable. If we compare the EG theory, which has the relatedness needs, the growth needs, and the existence needs, if we compare it to Maslow's hierarchy, you can see a lot of overlap, right? Where you could say the physiological needs and the physical security would be the ERG's existence. Now, you'll have to break up Maslow's physical security and then interpersonal security into two parts so that it'll fit here with the ERG model. Because if we look at interpersonal security, that kind of goes together with social needs, the belongingness, and then the self-esteem where the person is concerned about other people valuing them. So that could all be combined together into the ERG theory's relatedness needs. And then the type of self-esteem where we can feel good about ourselves, right? Like we respect ourselves and feel like we're being our best selves. Then that could be combined together with self-actualization to be ERG theory's growth. So you can see that even though there's not a lot of data to support Maslow's hierarchy of need, there was motive on the part of researchers to try and maybe simplify it or to do a better job of explaining how you progress through the levels, right? There's sort of this implication from Maslow that, once your physiological needs are met, then you turn to security needs. And once those are met, then you move to the next one. He never really talks about when there's a hit to your self-esteem, do you regress back or something like that? Whereas Alderfer did say, if there's a threat to your, relatedness need or to your growth need, you will cycle back. You will regress and have to kind of move back through the layers again. You'll also notice that Alderfer did not design his as a pyramid. The relatedness needs seem to be at the top, but I think that's kind of an arbitrary thing that he did. He didn't want it to be straight linear, so he didn't want them to all be at the same level. But the idea is more of a feedback loop where you sort of go through the different needs, maybe spend some time in one of the needs, and then if there's frustration, you will regress and revisit earlier needs. So very similar, but kind of different. Herzberg's two-factor theory, in this one, they're very specifically talking about determinants of job satisfaction versus job dissatisfaction. So it's literally designed to talk about in the workplace. The other two models could be applied to just humans in any kind of context. Here, it's Herzberg was deliberately designing this to be a workplace explanation. So you've got hygiene factors and you got motivational factors. And under hygiene, it's not what we normally think of as hygiene, that's for sure. We've got company policies, the quality of supervision, the relations with others, personal life, rate of pay, job security, working conditions. They're all sort of like physical things, things that could be under the control of the company, things like that. Relations with others, personal life, the company doesn't have control of those, but this is something that maybe the individual might have control over. Motivational factors are, on the other hand, going to be a lot more amorphous, right? Harder to pin down. So, achievement. What's that? Career advancement. Well, how far? Personal growth, job interest, recognition, responsibility. You can see that all of these are sort of concepts that need to be operationally defined. So motivational factors are always going to be those factors that are hard to pin down. You know it when you see it kind of thing. So the thing that Herzberg offered is that the things that make you satisfied with your job, you can't just say the opposite of that would make you dissatisfied with your job. He said hygienes contribute mostly to dissatisfaction, whereas the motivators tend to contribute to satisfaction. The empirical research on this model has been kind of mixed. It's not super clear that his model is accurate, but it's kind of an interesting way to look at it, that the company has control over a lot of the things that can make a person unhappy at the job. And these more amorphous things that might be difficult to pin down, those seem to contribute the most heavily to satisfaction at the job. I'm looking at the list of motivational factors. Some people like responsibility at work and some people don't. I just saw somebody on TV just last night say that he really likes working in the Target stockroom because it's such an organized place to be, and he really likes organizing things. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So let's take what he said and apply it to this model. I really like my job because it's a very organized place to be, and I like being organized. That would fall under job interest. He didn't say anything about how much he got paid or how secure he feels in the job or how great his supervisors were. He talked about how it matched what he really likes. Maybe he feels like he's going to grow as a person as he figures out new ways to organize things or whatever. Maybe he gets recognition for being, super organized and other people can find things where he put them and whatever. Or maybe he gets responsibility from, the way that he is handling it. He's being recognized and maybe getting more responsibility or maybe career advancement from it. Who knows? But it just seems like probably all the explanations for why he said that, and that's why he likes that job, probably fall under motivational factors. Let's compare these three needs theories. Okay, so we've got Alderfers EG Theory. I had already combined that with Maslows, so hopefully you could see the greater detail. This is a picture from our textbook, and it doesn't have quite the detail that the graphic I showed you earlier had on the Alderfer versus Maslow. But the Herzberg comparison is a good one. The safety and physiological needs are very similar to Herzberg's hygienes. And then the love, esteem, and self-actualization are in alignment with Herzberg's motivators. So 3 different theories. Probably Maslow, I guess we could say, is the most detailed. And Herzberg is probably the most glossing. But one thing they all share in common is there's not a lot of data to support their models of how what motivates people. That's the one thing they all have in common for sure. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the values model. The 1 values model, which is the job characteristics model. So again, I pulled this from our textbook, so this graphic should look familiar, but I broke it down into parts to make it sort of make a little bit more sense. So job characteristics model says, well, first off, I guess we're probably going to need to do some job analysis to find out what the core job dimensions are. I told you I'd be able to work job analysis into every lecture. So the core job dimensions lead to critical psychological states, which lead to personal and work outcomes. So core job dimensions might include things like skill variety, task identity, task significance, right? So you can kind of see those are like the actual things you're doing at work. Autonomy, that sort of sense of you're in control of your own behaviors during the day or your own timeline or things like that. And then how much feedback the individual gets about whether they're on track or not, things like that. So those are the core job dimensions. Under critical psychological states, we have whether the person experiences a sense of meaningfulness of the work. Like, do they feel like what they're doing is meaningful? How much they feel like they have responsibility over the outcomes of the work. Whether they get to have knowledge of the results, which is an interesting thing to list, right? Because sometimes, let's say you're working customer service and you have a person who calls and they have a problem with your product, and you give them all sorts of alternative ways to solve the problem. You may never hear from them again because they solved, one of the pieces of advice you gave solved the problem. Maybe because they decided to throw the object against the wall and that's it. I hate this thing. Who knows how it actually worked out. And sometimes you don't get to have knowledge of the results. It's one of the things that I find kind of fun about teaching is that my students oftentimes will send me updates about where they are and what they're doing. And it's like, oh, thank goodness I got to find out who went to grad school or, who's had a baby or other kinds of outcomes, like what happened. Because you guys take my class and then I may never see you again. And how did it work out? Like what happened? And then the last thing under the critical psychological states is the growth need strength. So how much the person is motivated by this growth need. Is that last part. Now, under personal and work outcomes, we have high internal motivation. So a person who inside of themselves already carries with them a lot of motivation, high quality of work performance, high satisfaction with the work, and then low absenteeism and turnover. So for 3 out of those 4 things on the personal and work outcomes, those are very measurable. High internal motivation, we have some ways of measuring it, but we'll talk about that more, and whether they're clear cut. So these are our core job dimensions, our critical psychological states, and our personal and work outcomes. Now let's start looking at the flow. So the idea in this model is that skill variety, task identity, and task significance lead to experience meaningfulness of the work. Autonomy leads to experience responsibility for the outcomes of the work. And then feedback leads to knowledge of the results. Then we have the flow out the other way. Sorry, I had to paste this together so you see I did not line it up perfectly, but experience meaningfulness of the work, experience responsibility for outcomes of the work, and knowledge of the results all sort of combine and inform, lead to, contribute to the high internal motivation, the high quality of work performance, the high satisfaction with the work, and low absenteeism and turnover. So those things on the far left, the core job dimensions, lead directly to their analogous critical psychological states, and then those things combine to lead to the personal and work outcomes. All right, and then underlying all of that, you'll notice none of the core job dimensions really contribute to the growth need strength, but the growth need strength moderates the effect of the core job dimensions on the critical psychological states, and the growth need strength moderates the effect of the critical psychological states on the personal and work outcomes. So that's what that little those orange arrows with the little circles are indicating, is that, growth needs strength can have an impact on how much the core job dimensions really affect the critical psychological states, and can have an impact on how much the critical psychological states are actually impacting the personal work outcomes. I think I said impact a lot of times there. Sorry. So it's a really complex model that's supposed to be tapping into what a person actually values. It's considered a theory of intrinsic motivation because it emphasizes personal mastery and control. Whenever you see autonomy on a list, that's considered an intrinsic motivation, something that a person carries inside of themselves. Whenever you see anything that alludes to having control over things, that's considered an intrinsic motivation. So we're going to talk about intrinsic motivations in this next segment. So I think I'll stop here and let's go ahead and talk about intrinsic motivation theories in the next segment.